Hello, I'm Bruce Goldstein. Thank you for joining us. I'm president of Farmworker Justice, the national advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Facebook program series, The State of Farm Workers in America in the COVID-19 Era. Farm workers have been designated essential workers to ensure our nation's food security during the COVID pandemic. Yet their working and living conditions create grave risks to their health and economic status. These programs raise awareness about the serious challenges the pandemic imposes on farm workers and their family members each and every day. This series identifies impactful work and innovative ideas being carried out by Farmworker Justice and other organizations that represent and serve farm workers around the country. So I'm very pleased to be welcoming today Neysa Shitakutle. Welcome, Neysa.
Hi, Bruce. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Neysa is research coordinator at the Farmworker Association of Florida. The Farmworker Association of Florida is headquartered in Apopka, Florida. It's a statewide organization. And we've had the privilege and pleasure of working with the association for many years. A lot of our work has been done together on pesticide safety. Neysa has been working with rural communities in Mexico and the U.S. Southeast since 2004. He joined the Farmworker Association of Florida in 2016. Neysa has been involved in addressing heat and pesticide exposure in the fields. He also develops strategies to make our food system more sustainable and just. Neysa is an anthropologist specializing in Mesoamerican peoples and cultures, labor, migration, and indigenous forms of governance. So Neysa, again, thank you for joining us today to talk about the impact of farm workers of COVID-19.
Thank you.
So to start, please tell us about the mission of Farmworker Association of Florida and its work, even before the COVID-19 pandemic.
Sure, yeah. The Farmworker Association of Florida is a grassroots organization that was formed in 1983, and its mission is to build power among farm workers so that they can make the decisions that affect their lives on political, environmental, labor, and social issues. So we're a community organization more than anything else. Our role is to help the community empower itself. Some of the work we have been doing since before the pandemic broke out was, as you mentioned, we've developed pesticide and heat-related illness trainings to inform farm workers about ways that they can protect themselves while they're working, but also education in food sovereignty, how our food system is structured, and also we report cases of wage theft and any kind of abuses that are perpetrated on farm workers.
Thank you. And why don't you tell our listeners what your role is at the association and what you've been working on?
Sure. Well, I'm research coordinator. One of the things that the Farmworker Association of Florida does is we work with research institutions who want to carry out community-based research, in particular on how it affects farm workers, or issues that affect farm workers, and one of those being heat-related illness and pesticide exposure. But there are also a range of social issues and other health-related issues. My role as research coordinator is to serve as community liaison and make sure that that research is carried out to meet the needs and concerns that the community may be facing, and also to let them know if there's anything that they are not comfortable doing, to be there for them and be their voice, and just to let them know in general what their rights are as participants.
Thank you. And for our listeners, Florida is generally rated as the second most important producer of labor-intensive agricultural products, fruits and vegetables, in the nation, just behind California. So Florida has always been an incredibly important place for not only the production of fruits and vegetables, but for the ideas that come out of organizing farm workers and trying to bring about change for the farm workers and their communities. So we know from the news that in general, the pandemic has affected Florida, but can you tell us what you're seeing and hearing about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on farm workers and their families and their communities?
Sure. Well, like a lot of people, farm workers are losing work. It is no secret that they've been deemed essential workers, and we're in real need of food right now as everybody's hunkering down. But most of the food that workers, most of the food that is produced in the United States goes to restaurants rather than grocery stores. And as that demand has decreased, so has the work that workers depend on to make a living. So they're losing work, and the ones who are able to work are facing conditions where they are not being provided personal protective equipment, as many other occupations are facing those issues. They're also not. They're also facing food shortages. Rural communities are especially vulnerable to access to quality food in this pandemic, and that inaccessibility to food has exacerbated those conditions in rural areas. They're also not being able to provide for some of their, the ones who do work are not able to find childcare to care for those children that they're leaving home. All the schools in Florida have closed for the rest of the school year, so it's been kind of difficult for them to find somebody to take care of their children.
Right. And can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and hearing about the housing? Our listeners may not be aware that there's actually a housing crisis for farm workers in the United States. There's a lack of housing. Farm workers' wages are very low. They can't afford a lot of the housing that is out there. And so in many situations, farm workers are living in dilapidated housing, or even if it's not dilapidated, they're crowded into housing to be able to afford it. And of course, during the pandemic, living in crowded housing poses tremendous risks. So I wonder what you're seeing and hearing about the housing situation for farm workers in Florida.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, farm workers, many farm workers are living in very crowded conditions, so that makes social distancing more difficult for them than it does for other people or other occupations. And sometimes you have several families living together because somebody may have lost their home. And also we have the problem of H-2A workers, the guest worker program. The housing conditions in which they live is just by design crowded. It's by labor camps, so they don't get a lot of social distancing they don't get a lot of social distancing at work, and they don't get a lot of social distancing in their living quarters. So that makes it very difficult for them.
Thanks. And on this H-2A agricultural guest worker program, because the employers are the ones who provide the housing, and it's usually barrack-style group housing and group sanitation facilities, our groups and many others joined together as a coalition to demand that the Trump administration issue safety and health requirements on the employers that participate in the H-2A program and bring in guest workers. And the administration has simply refused to do that, in placing these farm workers at incredible risk. And for those who don't know, the H-2A guest workers come from various countries. The majority come from Mexico, and they usually come in on buses from northern Mexico for long bus rides in crowded buses before they're put into crowded housing. So we've pointed this out. We're making the demands. Many of us are urging the state governments to adopt standards and safety and health precautions because the federal government refuses to do so. Which brings me to my question for you is, the next question is, what has the Farm Worker Association of Florida been doing to address the pandemic, and that is, how has it shifted its priorities given the urgency of the situation?
One of the immediate need that we saw was access to food. So what we started doing right away was making food runs to those communities that were seeing food shortages, and we're actually taking donations just to be able to keep doing that work. But also being a voice for those workers. We've been approached by several news organizations who want to know how those workers are, what the situation is that they're facing. And lastly, we also want to make sure that the pandemic is sort of serving as an excuse to implement some policies that are detrimental to workers, like reducing wages for H-2A workers. So we are also working to make sure that those things don't become part of the national narrative.
Right, and we're all working together to challenge Congress's failure to include many farm workers in programs that it has developed. One of the key problems is that some of these programs may help some farm workers, but exclude many of them because these programs often exclude undocumented immigrants. And the majority of farm workers nationally are undocumented immigrants. Do you know how many, do you have an estimate of the percentage of farm workers in Florida who are undocumented immigrants?
No, I don't have the actual statistics, but I think it's about the same as the national statistics, which is about 2/3 of farm workers are undocumented.
Okay. So you've talked a little bit about the lack of adequate access to food of farm workers, which is, of course, the great cruel irony that the farm workers who produce some of our healthiest food for us to ingest and to consume often can't afford to pay for that food, and sometimes don't even have physical access to it. So, you know, what are you seeing regarding the pandemic's impact on the food supply?
I think one of the biggest problems we're seeing is to go back to the crowded working and living conditions that many farm workers live in, that they're especially vulnerable to the outbreak. And it's not going to take but a few cases to pop up in the farm working population to disrupt the food supply. And as I don't know how many of our listeners are aware of this, but the Smithfield plant in South Dakota, I think it was, they ended up finding 300 workers who had been infected with COVID-19, and there was a more recent case in Central Washington State. I think those cases highlight just how fragile the system is set up, and it's affecting those workers. So when workers live really close together and they work really close together, it's not going to take that long to, or it's not going to be that difficult to disrupt the food supply. We rely on their labor.
Right, and one of our concerns is that it may be that the pandemic is reaching rural areas later and will be just as devastating in these rural areas. In a lot of places around the country, the seasons are really just beginning. Um, and so the worst, unfortunately, may be yet to come. There's a newspaper report today or in the last couple of days that a single farm in North Carolina has 8 workers who tested positive for COVID-19. They stayed open, I guess, for a few days, selling the produce to people who would drive up in their cars, but now they've shut it down. And one of the issues is with the consolidation of agriculture into bigger and bigger companies, right, it's easier to disrupt the food supply. So I know that you're somebody who analyzes the food system and has ideas about reforming the food system in ways that would make it both sustainable for consumers and the environment, but also improve the ability of farm workers to lead better lives. So what are the reforms that you'd like to see in the food system?
One would be better wages. Of course, we would like our workers to be paid fairly and for their work to be treated with the respect that it deserves, but also to make adjustments to make sure that our food is more locally sourced so that that invigorates those communities, and those people who work to get our food out are also able to have access to that food. And that would also benefit not just those local communities, but generally consumers that would have access to fresher, more environmentally friendly food. So that would include also reduction in use of pesticides and other toxins. I think using a lot of those pesticides that are used is just to ensure that the crops last longer and they're able to ship them farther away. What else?
Oh, no, that's helpful. Thank you. Before we wrap up with a final question for you, let me just tell our listeners that farmworkerjustice.org is our website. We have a wealth of information about COVID-19 on our dedicated COVID page. Go to our advocacy and programs page and you'll see the dedicated page to COVID-19 where we have various resources for farm workers, for policymakers, for researchers. We also have a lot of information about immigration policy and pesticide safety and other occupational safety and health issues on our website. We operate to serve farm workers, but they can't afford to pay for our services. So we depend on our listeners and viewers for their charitable donations. So you can make donations to Farm Worker Justice at our website, and you can also send donations by mail to the address on our website in Washington, D.C. And I should mention that right now we have a generous matching challenge grant. An anonymous donor is willing to give Farm Worker Justice $30,000 if we can raise that $30,000. So we're in the process of doing that. So your donation is effectively doubled. So we hope you'll take that action. So now turning back to Neysa from the Farm Worker Association of Florida, why don't you tell our listeners how they can be helpful to farm workers in Florida and to the Farm Worker Association of Florida?
Well, we're also accepting donations, but if you go to our website at floridafarmworkers.org, you can click on their volunteer. We're not taking volunteers for at this time, but there are also ways you can help make sure that farm workers are treated more humanely and that we work together to create some real change in how our food system is organized.
Thank you. So again, thank you, Neysa. On behalf of my team and the Board of Directors of Farm Worker Justice, I want to thank our viewers and listeners and followers for joining us today for our Facebook series, The State of Farm Workers in the COVID-19 era. We are broadcasting each day these couple of weeks and maybe longer. We record our interviews in the morning and we post them on our Facebook page, generally at about 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time, or just a few minutes later. We also post them on the Farm Worker Justice YouTube channel. Tomorrow, we are going to be joined by a special guest, Eva Longoria, very well-known actress and business person and philanthropist. Eva Longoria was the co-producer of 2 documentary films about farm workers, one called The Harvest, about children, and one called Food Chains, about reforming the food supply chain to improve conditions for farm workers in this country. We're also later in the week going to be joined by representatives of grassroots organizations that are serving farm workers and especially farm worker women. So please join us on our Facebook page for these interviews as well as for last week's interviews for valuable information about farm workers and how to help farm workers solve the problems that they face. Thank you all very much. Best wishes.